think it's going to be extremely difficult to identify how we would know that we need to deploy it. One of the ironies of geoengineering is it probably would be more effective if we did it slowly and compensating for the slowness of mitigation, which is absolutely necessary but is proceeding slowly. But it's going to take some kind of an emergency or sense of emergency for people to accept the idea of global management of the climate. So it may be that we're pushed to a situation where we feel that we have to use it rapidly. And I think that's one of the frightening things about geoengineering. And that's why it's so important for us to know as much as possible in advance, so that we know that it might be a very bad idea. And then we wouldn't do it, even when we were under that kind of duress. As for field testing, that's a broad category. And as part of learning about how geoengineering works, we would certainly want to be doing certain kinds of field testing, which are really quite benign and acceptable. That's not to say that they don't require some kind of social sanctioning process, that there would be some way for people to get engaged in it. And actually, that's one of the things that I think is really important about geoengineering, is that it kind of requires that social engagement and involvement in the decision to do this kind of field testing, because that in itself is a learning process for not only for scientists but for the public, and how these things are working and how you make decisions about them will help down the road if and when we ever hope we don't, fervently hope we never have to make that kind of decision. But if we did, getting people involved in making a decision about doing a small-scale field test would be useful experience for later more serious decisions. And there's a lot of concerns that I have about vested interests of all sorts. I think that I have a lot of experience, for example, in remediation of environmentally contaminated sites. And the history is that you would find industries that grew up to do the job, that were contracted to do the job. A story I like to tell is when we used to dig up leaking gas tanks, because they were the gasoline and oil would get into the ground, and so you were forced to dig them up and dig up all the contaminated soil and truck it away to a Class 3 landfill. Well, that over time we began to understand that if you took out the source of the leak and you removed the tank, that you could kind of leave the rest of it there, and the little bugs and organisms in the soil would eat the oil, and over time it would just be remediated. But the industry that grew up to dig up these tanks and clean them up was just really upset about changing the regulations, because their livelihood was affected. We really don't want to get in a situation with geoengineering where somebody's livelihood is affected by decisions we make about the environment of the globe. And we don't want them to have a vested interest in the choices that we, as a global population, have to make. And so that vested interest is to me, a big problem. Another part, but there are all kinds of vested interests that will come about. Scientists are going to have vested interests. They're going to invest their time and try to find methods that work. And they're going to try to find things that they can believe in. So another way in which we have to be careful is that we can't allow decisions to be made about what we do about geoengineering by organizations and people who are investigating the possibility of geoengineering. They have to be made by independent bodies who really should have responsibility for our entire climate strategy. Of course, we don't have a climate strategy, but we should. And so that the onus needs to be on people that are removed. So those are my two ethical issues. And of course, the one that you can't escape as well is that there is a probability that if you do use an intervention technique, you're going to layer one unnatural, if you like, or one anthropogenically forced climate on top of another one. And we don't really know what's going to happen. No one can predict it. You may not even be able to tell whether or not your intervention is responsible for the effects you observe. That in alone is a scientific problem of great proportions, huge proportions. But beyond that, we know that the effects will be uneven. And so some people will be hurt and some people will be helped. I mean, you certainly wouldn't go into an intervention without believing that most people would be helped. But it's quite likely that some people won't be helped. And it's also very likely that you won't be able to prove it. And so that knotty problem is one that has to be dealt with. And in some ways, I think it's similar and probably should be tied to the problem of adaptation and unequal effects, or the harsher effects that are felt by people in the southern hemisphere and people that are in densely populated areas that will have even existential threats. And I think these are the same kinds of problems. What do we owe humanity? What do we owe nature? And those, I think we'll be snared more in an argument about cause and effect if we ever deploy geoengineering, which will be a very, very difficult argument to settle. And so it may not be the best way to do it. The best way to do it might be to circumvent the whole thing and just talk about what we owe humanity. I think that we need to have a research program, and the research program needs to be heavily involved with the public. And we need to have engagement so that citizens and representatives of citizens, engaged public, need to be involved in understanding what questions we're trying to answer, so that when these questions start to be answered and questions about the answers start to arise, it's not that we're, two things are happening. One, the scientists are having an engaged audience, which they need. I think one thing that happened in climate science is that scientists didn't have an engaged public, and so they became very desperate about the fact that they saw these dire things happening and the public wasn't responding. And desperate acts ensued. The second thing that happened was that the public couldn't really own the results. I mean, they didn't, from the other side. So the public didn't really understand. They weren't engaged in saying, "Oh, gee, is climate change a problem? Let's figure that out." And so when they started getting this data, which is filled with uncertainty, it's just nobody can tell you what's going to happen, but the data is very disturbing. And because it's uncertain, it was very difficult for the public to understand it. So my sense is that we need to change the way we do this kind of research. We need to be more engaged and have more interplay where the public is helping to set the research agenda, and the scientists are engaging with the public right from the beginning about what they know and what they don't know and how they know it and what they're afraid of. So that seems to me to be the priority right now, is to get that going, because we just don't know what's going to happen. And if anybody tells you that they know what's going to happen, you should immediately think of them as a charlatan. No one knows what's going to happen. But we do know one thing. We are increasing the risk of something really bad happening. We do know that. And those risks require insurance, require options. And so we need to develop those options.